I noticed something was wrong the moment he smiled at me for the third time in 10 minutes. Not because the smile was unfriendly, because it never changed. My name doesn't matter as much as what I'm about to tell you. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I live on 42 acres outside of Bozeman, Montana, and I spent 31 years as a high school librarian. I know how to read people. I know how to sit quietly and watch. And I know when someone is performing rather than living. My husband, Kenneth, passed away 4 years ago this coming March. Pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't get a long goodbye. We barely got a short one. What he left behind was the land, the house we'd built together, a modest life insurance policy, and an investment account I'd managed carefully ever since. Not because I'm wealthy by any stretch, because Kenneth worked hard and I didn't touch what we'd saved. And over time, careful living adds up. The account sat at just under $2 million. The land alone had been appraised at $600,000. It's mostly because Bozeman had grown up around us over the decades, and suddenly our quiet corner of Montana was worth something to developers. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is and what she'll always be. She's 34. She teaches elementary school. She has her father's laugh and my stubbornness and a goodness in her that I cannot take any credit for. She came to it naturally. She is, without qualification, the best thing Kenneth and I ever did. She met him at a friend's birthday party, a weekend trip to Missoula. She called me that Sunday night, and I could hear it in her voice before she said a word. That particular kind of breathless. I'd heard it once before, when she was 17, and had just gotten into the summer art program she'd applied for. Pure, uncomplicated joy. She told me his name. She told me he was 38, worked in commercial real estate, had grown up in Billings. She told me he was funny and attentive, and that he'd walked her to her car even though it was raining, and she'd had an umbrella and he hadn't. I said all the right things. I was happy for her. I was. I met him for the first time about 6 weeks later, when she brought him up for a long weekend. He pulled into the gravel drive in a clean silver truck, got out before she did, and came around to open her door. Then he walked up to me with his hand already extended and his smile already on. "You must be the famous Ruth Ann," he said. She had never once called me Ruth Ann in her life. She called me Mom. I shook his hand. I smiled back. I told myself I was being uncharitable. That weekend, he complimented the house twice, the land 3 times, and my cooking once. The compliments about the land weren't like a person admiring something beautiful. They were more like a person taking inventory. He asked where our property line was to the north. He asked whether the creek was ours or shared. He asked how long we'd owned it. I answered everything. I had no reason not to. And I told myself it was just conversation. That people who work in real estate naturally think about land the way librarians think about organization systems. It's just the lens you see through. But the third time he asked about the western boundary, after I'd already answered it twice, I felt something shift in my chest. Not alarm exactly. More like the feeling you get when you're reading a book and you realize you misunderstood something several chapters back, and now you have to go back and reconsider everything. I watched him more carefully after that. By Thanksgiving, my daughter was in love. By Christmas, she was talking about their future in the casual, confident way people do when they've already decided. I liked the way she laughed around him, genuinely and often. I liked that she seemed settled. What I didn't like was harder to name. He had a way of steering conversations. Nothing obvious. But if the topic drifted away from something he was interested in, he'd find a thread to pull it back. And the thread almost always led somewhere near what we owned. At Christmas dinner, he asked about my investment advisor. I mentioned I had one, didn't elaborate. He nodded like I'd said something he already knew and moved on. Later that evening, when my daughter had gone upstairs to wrap a last-minute gift, he asked whether I'd ever considered a trust structure for the property. For tax purposes, he said. For simplicity, he said. He knew someone who specialized in rural estate planning and could give me a consultation no charge. I told him I had an attorney I trusted. He smiled the same smile, the one that didn't change. Of course, he said. Just thought it might be helpful. My daughter came back downstairs and the conversation moved on, and I sat with the discomfort of not being able to explain why a considerate offer had felt like a hand reaching into my coat pocket. In February, he proposed. A ring he'd had custom made, she told me. She called me from his apartment, her voice doing that same thing it had done the first time she called about him. I cried a little. I was happy for her. I was. But I was also already asking myself questions I didn't know how to answer. I called my attorney, a woman named, well, I'll just say she'd handled our estate planning for 15 years and I trusted her completely. I told her I wanted to update my will and review all the documentation around the property and the accounts. I didn't tell her why. She didn't ask. She set the appointment for the following week and we went through everything carefully. I made sure my daughter was the sole beneficiary of everything. I made sure the deed was airtight. I made sure there was nothing that could be amended without my explicit written consent, notarized and witnessed. Then I called my investment advisor and asked him to flag my account so that any changes required a secondary confirmation call, to my cell phone only. I didn't tell my daughter any of this. She was happy. She was planning a wedding. I didn't want to put something in her path that might not be anything at all. That might just be an overprotective mother who'd been widowed and was terrified of losing anything else. But then something happened that I couldn't explain away. My daughter had a doctor's appointment in early March. Routine, she said. She'd mentioned it the week before when I'd called. A Tuesday at 2 o'clock. I knew because I'd made a note of it, the way mothers do. He called her doctor's office. I only know this because the receptionist at my daughter's clinic happened to be the younger sister of one of my former students. Small town adjacency, Montana runs on it. She mentioned it to her sister, who mentioned it to me without realizing what she was sharing. She just said she'd had an odd call from a man identifying himself as my daughter's fiancé, asking to confirm that her appointment was for a routine check and whether there had been any recent changes to her health status. The clinic hadn't given him anything. They'd asked his name, told him they couldn't confirm or deny appointment information to non-authorized parties, and ended the call. But he'd tried. I sat with that for 3 days before I could think about it clearly. Why would a man call his fiancé's doctor? Without her knowledge? What would make that seem like a reasonable thing to do? The only answers I kept coming back to were not good ones. I hired a private investigator. I want to be clear about this because I've since talked to other women who've been in situations that rhymed with mine, and they always ask whether they felt guilty doing it. I didn't. I felt like I was finally doing what I should have done months earlier. What the investigator found took about 3 weeks to put together. He was thorough and he was discreet. What he found was this. The man my daughter was going to marry had, in the past 7 years, been in 2 previous long-term relationships. The first had ended when that woman, a widow in her late 50s, had discovered he'd approached her bank posing as a financial co-planner. The second had ended when the woman, a divorced woman in her early 60s with significant assets, had found documentation suggesting he'd been in contact with an estate attorney she'd never heard of. In both cases, no charges were ever filed. In both cases, he had moved on cleanly. There was more. His business, commercial real estate consulting, had almost no verifiable clients. His income, based on what the investigator could find, was difficult to account for. His lifestyle, which included the clean silver truck and a well-furnished apartment in Bozeman, didn't obviously match it. And then there was something smaller, something that hit me harder than any of the rest of it. In a conversation I'd had with my daughter the previous month, she'd mentioned that he'd been asking her questions about me, about my health, about whether I had a plan for the property if I couldn't manage it alone anymore. She'd told me this offhandedly, as something he'd said that had made her feel cared for, because it seemed like he was thinking about the future, about family, about making sure everyone was taken care of. She hadn't heard what I heard. I had to tell her. I had understood that from the beginning, but I had not yet figured out how, and the wedding was 4 months away, and she was already deep into the planning of it, and she was happy, and she loved him, and I knew that what I was about to do was going to break something that could not be unbroken. I want to be honest about this part because I've heard criticism of how I handled it, and some of that criticism is fair. I should have sat down with her sooner. I should have handed her the investigator's report and a cup of coffee and let her read it in her own kitchen with her own time. I know that now. I knew it then, actually. But she wouldn't take my calls for a week after I'd tried to raise concerns gently in January, before I even had evidence, and I was terrified that if I came to her with accusations and she dismissed them, I'd lose access to her entirely before I had the chance to show her the truth. So I waited. I made a mistake in waiting. And then I made another decision that was complicated. The wedding was held on a Saturday in late September. A small venue outside of town, a converted barn she'd fallen in love with the moment she'd seen it. She'd shown me pictures for months. The flowers were cream and dusty blue. She'd asked me to help her choose the tablecloths, and I had. And I'd sat in that florist's shop with her and pretended everything was fine because I was still trying to figure out how not to detonate a bomb in the middle of her happiness. She knew, by then, that I had concerns. We'd had one conversation in August, careful and painful, where I'd said I thought she should slow down. She'd looked at me with those eyes that were her father's and said, "Mom, I love him. I know you're scared of losing me, but you have to trust me." I hadn't told her about the investigator. I hadn't told her about the doctor's office call. I hadn't told her about the 2 previous women. I should have. I own that. The morning of the wedding, she texted me, "Today's the day. I love you so much. No matter what, okay?" No matter what. I read it 3 times. I didn't know exactly what she meant. I thought she was being generous, giving me an emotional out for whatever feelings I had about the day. I texted back that I loved her and I would be there. I arrived at the venue early to help with flowers. She was in the back room with her bridesmaids. One of them brought me back to see her, and when I walked in, she was standing in her dress in front of the mirror, and she was so beautiful I had to look away for a moment to collect myself. She turned around and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before on her face. Something steady, decided. "Mom," she said. The bridesmaids were there. She didn't lower her voice. "I need you to hold my bouquet for a minute." She handed it to me, flowers first, and inside, tucked between the ribbon wrap and the stems, was a folded piece of paper. I looked at her. She held my eyes. She gave a small nod. I unfolded it. "Mom, I found the report, the one you hid in the linen closet. I read everything. I need you to stand up today when they ask. I can't do it myself. I love you. Don't let me make this mistake." I read it twice. My hands were not steady. I looked up at her. She was still watching me. Her chin was high and her eyes were full, but she wasn't going to cry. I could see her deciding not to, the same way she'd decided things her whole life. I said, "You're sure?" she said. "I'm sure." I put the note in my purse. I handed her back the bouquet. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock. I sat in the front row, which is where mothers of the bride sit, and I watched my daughter walk down the aisle toward a man I was about to publicly accuse of being a predator. I watched her smile at him. I watched him smile back. Still the same smile. And in that moment, I stopped doubting myself entirely. The officiant reached the part every ceremony reaches, the part about objections. I stood up. I want to describe what happened in the room, because it was not at all like the movies. There was no gasp. There was a silence, and it was the particular kind of silence that follows something that the air in a room has been anticipating without knowing it. People turned. My daughter stood at the altar and looked at me. He looked at me. Something moved behind his expression. Not surprise, exactly, but something more like the face of a person recalculating. "I apologize for interrupting," I said, "and I meant it, but I need to share some information before the ceremony continues." I was brief. I had made notes. I had 3 things: the investigator's report, the names and general circumstances of the 2 previous women, and the documented call to my daughter's doctor's office. I said what I needed to say clearly and without dramatics. I did not accuse him of being a criminal. I said I had reason to believe his intentions were not what he had represented, and I asked my daughter if, in light of this, she would like to pause. She said yes. He left, not dramatically. He turned and walked up the aisle and out the door, and the click of that barn door closing was the loudest sound I've ever heard in my life. My daughter stood at the altar for a moment, still holding her bouquet. Then she walked toward me, and when she reached me, she put her head against my shoulder. And we stood like that in front of everyone while the room didn't know what to do with itself. Later, someone told me there was a smattering of applause. I didn't hear it. I was only paying attention to the weight of her head on my shoulder, and the way she was breathing, slow and deliberate, the way she'd breathed when she was small, and had just finished crying, and was settling herself back down into the world. The venue let us use the space anyway. We had the dinner. My daughter's friends stayed, and so did the family who'd come from out of state, and we sat in that converted barn with the cream and dusty blue flowers, and ate the food and talked quietly and let the day be what it had become instead of what it had been planned to be. She told me, weeks later, everything she'd put together on her own. She'd found the investigator's report by accident. I had hidden it poorly, or maybe not really wanted to hide it at all. She'd read it over the course of an evening while he was out. She'd gone back through months of small moments and reinterpreted them the way you do when you finally have the key to something you've been staring at. She said it was like watching a photograph develop. Things that hadn't made sense suddenly resolved into a shape she could name. She said she'd almost confronted him directly. She said she was afraid of what he'd say, afraid he'd find some explanation that she'd want to believe, afraid of her own willingness to be convinced. So she'd come to the wedding because she'd needed a witness. She'd come because she'd needed me. He never contacted her after. Whatever he'd hoped to accomplish, he understood it was finished. The investigator told me later, as a professional observation, that men like this tend to move on efficiently. There's nothing personal in what they do. That's almost the most disturbing part of it. My daughter stayed with me for 3 weeks after the wedding. We walked the land every morning, the 42 acres that her father had loved and I had kept and she had grown up on. We walked to the creek and we walked the northern boundary and we walked back. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just walked. She's back in her own place now. She's teaching. She's doing well, or she's doing the thing that looks like doing well while something in you repairs, which is its own kind of doing well. We talk every day, not always for long. Sometimes just a few minutes, sometimes more. She calls me on her lunch break. She asks about the land, about the garden, about whether I've fixed the fence post that's been leaning since June. I tell her about my week. She tells me about her students. Last month, she drove up for the weekend. We sat on the porch on Saturday evening and watched the light do what it does over Montana in October, which is something that cannot be properly explained to someone who hasn't seen it. Golden and long and very still. She said, "Thank you for not giving up." I told her I couldn't have. She's the best thing. She's always been the best thing. We sat there until the light was gone, and then we went inside, and I made us dinner, and we ate at the kitchen table with the window open and the cold air coming in off the fields. And it smelled like hay and pine and the particular clean smell of a Montana fall. Whatever he'd wanted from us, the land, the accounts, the careful years of ordinary living Kenneth and I had built together, he didn't get any of it. What he got instead was a door closing quietly behind him on the best day I can remember in 4 years. And what I kept was everything that mattered.